Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios in Johannesburg. Hello and welcome to this week's final episode of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight, with COVID-19 numbers rising once again, fear is mounting that a fifth wave may come sooner rather than later. My first guest is the National Health Department's Deputy Director General, Dr. Nicholas Crisp. Hope for the Nelson Mandela Metro as the biggest political parties, the ANC and the DA, mull a grand coalition that could come into effect as early as next week. Leaders of the two parties share their thoughts with us. And 2 weeks after the National Planning Commission gave us their own appraisal of their work, outsiders looking in share their perspectives of what is wrong with the country's national economic development blueprint.
I'll excuse myself. I think you missed it. I think I should also. Thank you.
We end the show with that drama journalists witnessed today between Parliament's Public Accounts Committee Chairperson Kuleko Shengwa and ESKOM board member Busi Mavuso. All that and more in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. This week's uptick in COVID-19 numbers has raised fears that a fifth wave may hit the country much earlier than anticipated. At least 4,631 new cases were recorded in the last reporting period, according to the latest available statistics released earlier today. One death was recorded. 26,065 tests were conducted in the last 24 hours, and that represents a 17.8% positivity rate. Total fatalities are 100,286 to date. To help us make sense of what we have seen this week, we do have on the line the National Health Department's Deputy Director General, Dr. Nicholas Crisp. Dr. Crisp, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. This has been a conversation point this week, especially over the past 3 days, especially. What have you as the department read into these numbers?
Good evening, Will, and good evening to the viewers. So we've been watching these figures for a couple of weeks already, in fact, almost 3 weeks, because there's been a slight change in the dominance of the variants that we are seeing in the testing space, and also just wondering how this new subvariant is going to behave. And for the last week or so, we have been aware of some increasing numbers in parts of the country. It wasn't unexpected. So as we've said before, we watch carefully for any flare-ups or upticks. We have, of course, just had Easter weekend with a lot of people moving around. So that may be what has resulted in these numbers. So at this stage, it's just very closely watching what is happening.
Could the movements of the Easter weekend be, or are they the only factor that you could identify?
No, there are many factors. I mean, we've learned to be very careful with COVID. It's mutating all the time. So what we are seeing at the moment, and have been for some weeks now, is changes in what we call the subvariants. So that's just minor mutations of Omicron. And I think viewers will have been watching what's happening in China with the BA2. We have had BA2 in South Africa for some time, but we also have what's called BA4 and BA5, which are subvariants of Omicron. and they do have some mutations in parts of their gene sequence that we have seen before that cause a little bit more transmissibility and infection. So we've been watching the growth and the dominance, the change in dominance of these subvariants for, as I said, for a couple of weeks already. At this stage, we're not alarmed about it. We do know that when people move around and take off their masks and spend time together, there is increased transmission. So this may be one of the factors, but it's always a confluence of many factors when we see increases in numbers like this.
And when you say you are not alarmed at this stage, Dr. Crisp, does that necessarily mean that there's no danger lurking?
No, not necessarily, not at all. It just means that this is very early days. This may be a minor flare-up and that the fifth wave will come from a different variant and will come later. But it may be that there's sufficient virulence or aggressiveness within this variant and enough transmissibility that's passing it on from one of us to the other for it to cause more infections. We are seeing hospitalizations. We are seeing children being hospitalized. We're seeing a lot of young people. And of those that, look, the numbers are still small, but of the people who are being admitted, it's unvaccinated people. And we've warned repeatedly that just thinking that you may have wild virus immunity because there's wild virus immunity in the community is insufficient. We don't know how long those antibodies last for, and we don't know how protective they are. What we do know is repeated exposure to the vaccines through vaccination programs does help to get better remembered immunity. And what we talk about is cellular immunity, not just antibodies. So we have complex immune responses, and we don't get enough immunity from being exposed just once. We need to be repeatedly exposed, and preferably by a safe protein that is similar to the virus and not the virus itself. So we really want to encourage people, don't wait until this does or doesn't become a wave. If you have not been vaccinated, get vaccinated. And if you have been vaccinated, make sure you have all your doses, including a booster.
So we shouldn't drop our guard, so to speak. In other words, we shouldn't be less cautious simply because many of us have been vaccinated, or generally there's higher levels of immunity in communities because of what we've been exposed to before.
Yes, well, that's exactly it. It would be a fatal mistake to let down our guard until we know this is completely past. This is in our hands as citizens in the country. The government provides the vaccine and provides vaccination services, and we have the support of all the provinces and hundreds of private providers who are helping with these services. So they are available, and we really want to encourage people, go out and get vaccinated now.
And how is progress on vaccination now? Have there been any new takers in significant numbers?
Boy, it's very disappointing. We're doing, fortunately, there's been a small uptick again this week. I think because people watch the numbers and they think, oh my goodness, I should go and get vaccinated. So we are seeing numbers of more than 50,000 a day at the moment, but many of those are second doses and booster doses. So we're only seeing about 10,000 new doses, new people who've never been vaccinated before per day. And that's of concern. We should be seeing much larger numbers. We still have the capacity to vaccinate 250,000 people a day. And for those, some sites have had to close down because it's not viable for them anymore, especially in the private sector where it was very marginal in the first place. But if we get large numbers of people willing to be vaccinated, then I'm sure they will open up again. They know exactly how to do it.
And I mean, from previous conversations, it was anticipated that the new wave may hit in the winter months. If the trend we've been seeing, especially over the past week, continues, does that necessarily mean or translate into the fifth wave hitting us much earlier than previously anticipated?
So if we speak loosely about waves, and when we're in and out of a wave, and there are some numerical cutoff points that we use just for convenience sake. But basically what happens is that when the virus starts to replicate in a community, it's copying itself and it's being spread from one of us to the other. When it's cold and we jam into common spaces, like we do in winter, and we don't spend so much time outside, we close our windows because it's cold outside, it's our behavior that changes the way in which we're exposed to the virus. So right now, this is the start of the flu season, which we haven't seen for 2 years because we've been wearing face masks. So we are seeing a variant of the flu virus, and that tends to be more dangerous for older people as well. We are also seeing amongst children, which we do see annually, but we are seeing what's called the RSV, the respiratory syncytial virus. And now, of course, we have not got rid of COVID. We knew that. And we do still have Omicron in circulation. And particularly now, a number of the variants, they're changing their pattern. So viruses are amongst us all the time. It's our behavior that changes the way in which they move. So it's not about winter per se, it's about the way we behave during winter that really matters.
Okay. I know probably there's a bit of naughtiness on my side asking you this. Any chance of a rethink, of, all the things that were relaxed in the event what we're seeing now continues on a much higher scale?
Yeah, I sort of thought you might ask me some questions like that, Fuyo. Not really. Unless there's a major, extremely virulent, destructive killer variant that comes up, it's not likely that we will go to those sorts of extremes. We're all tired of it. We're not really in that phase of the pandemic that requires that kind of behavior. What it requires is for all of us voluntarily to be responsible, to maintain social distancing, keep washing our hands, wear masks as much as possible, and make sure we're in a ventilated space. And that really will do as much as possible other than vaccination. But we know that vaccination is the way to prevent the spread of diseases like this, because then we make immunity and we reduce the chances of us spreading viruses to others. So the combination of these effects should be plenty, that we do not need to go back to those very difficult times that we remember from 2 years ago.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crisp, Dr. Nicholas Crisp, who is the Deputy Director General in the National Health Department, on the back, of course, of those rising numbers of COVID-19 cases, which have raised fears that a fifth wave may come sooner rather than later. Still coming up, once upon a time, well, not too long ago actually, they were political arch enemies, the ANC and the DA, that is, certainly at the Nelson Mandela Bay, but now they are mulling a grand coalition that could run that metropolitan municipality as early as next week. We speak to the two parties, and still coming up 2 weeks after the National Planning Commission gave us their own appraisal of their work. Tonight we have two outsiders looking in and sharing their perspectives of what is wrong with our country's national economic development blueprint. But also coming up, that drama we saw at ESKOM today, rather interesting or peculiar in those circumstances, exchange between the chairperson of Parliament's Public Accounts Committee and a board member of ESKOM. All of that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which continues right after this short ad break. One of the shortcomings of the National Development Plan is the incapacity of the state to implement proposals of the National Development Plan. So thanks. The chairperson of the National Planning Commission, Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Gungubele.
One of the shortcomings that they identified through this discussion was the incapacity of the state to implement the proposals of the NDP. This often combined with poor leadership that pay lip service to the NDP without understanding its scope has acted as an obstacle to implementation of the developmental objectives. As government, we are clear that the greatest challenge has been around implementation, and in the discussions held to date, this was my emphasis, and collectively together with yourselves.
The Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission, Professor Maluleka, says they know how far off target we are as the country, and he says plans are being made to rectify that.
At least we know how far off target we are. We have a plan, and we can track our progress against that plan as a country. And we can correct this. And I'm convinced that given the caliber of men and women who are in the third National Planning Commission, wonderful, amazing, patriotic South Africans with skills in different areas, a multidisciplinary team. I think that that team gives me hope. And also the power that we have as the National Planning Commission, the power to convene government, the power to assist government in thinking around implementation, and of course to engage them and make them accountable for failure to implement are some of the powers that we're going to try and use.
Well, we do tonight have two outsiders looking in, whereas last week we had the people involved making an appraisal or giving us an appraisal of their own work. But this evening we do have Pheliso Ngomo, who's a development economist, but also the chairperson of Oxfam. But we also have Lumkile Mondi. Good evening to both of you, and thank you very much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Vuyo, and to the viewership. Thank you so much for having us.
Okay. I don't know if you both agree with the chairperson of the National Planning Commission, who says that the greatest challenge really is implementation. Pheliso?
Yes, it is the greatest challenge in implementation, but also profoundly, I think it's the capacity of the state to meet some of the set objectives that are in the development plan. So the National Development Plan is a socio-economic plan that is actually designed to lift South Africa out of its scourge of poverty, unemployment, and social inequality. We've just heard now that our unemployment has actually increased, from 32% to 35%, 35.3%. So it's actually clear that it's not only about the capacity, but its inability to integrate as well the National Development Plan within the government's program, both in terms of their own annual plans, that's one, but also in terms of their medium planning, which is called a medium strategic, framework. So in essence, it actually means that we have an institution that is responsible for planning, but also we have institutions that is responsible for execution. But in fact, there's no convergence, but instead there's actually divergence. But also profoundly, the failure of the government to meet the NDP also speaks to the fact that the annual planning system, by the way, may not be an appropriate system that is meant to deliver the NDP. Because NDP, rightfully so, focuses on longitudinal planning with some low-hanging fruit. But in fact, what the annual planning system of government just focuses on, quantitative outcomes, right? Now, in reality, is that you're never going to be able to actually meet the objective of a longitudinal, plan with quantitative annual, planning interventions. So already, from that perspective, it's actually difficult. I think the second issue, which is really the chunk, which is quite important, is that South Africa as a country has actually socially evolved. Amongst that social evolution includes rapid urbanization, right? So it also, therefore, you need to really think about whether some of the aspects that are within NDP would be relevant, which was developed in 2011 or 2012, which will be relevant in 2022. And I think it really puts on the spotlight the issue of whether those who are in the planning and the implementation are in conversation with each other, but also there's a very clear understanding from a diagnosis perspective of what challenges are we confronted with. Because by design, urbanization speaks to the fact that people are going to look for jobs. We know that our economy has actually been, shrinking. We've experienced deindustrialization, for instance, which in essence would be demanding both unskilled and semi-skilled sector. We are seemingly building a very vibrant tertiary or services sector, which requires technical expertise. So the key question is whether the document really speaks to the challenges of today that South Africans are actually confronted with. So it means that if it doesn't, or it addresses one or the other, but then the institutional organizations of departments that is meant to deliver some of the key objectives, it actually means that they are always going to be a moving target. They're going to be chasing a moving target perpetually without meeting the actual objectives of what the socio-economic plan is meant to do.
Okay. Lumkile Monde, from your vantage point?
So the issue, Vuyo, is not so much about implementation. The issue is about the choices that have been made by the governing party on how it wants to move forward. So what am I saying, Vuyo? I'm saying our plan is about our future. It is about us to make it work, because South Africa belongs to all its people, and the future of South Africa is our collective future. However, what we've seen is choices that were made by the governing party where it sought to deviate from the plan and implement what they referred to as radical economic transformation, which basically accept and own the national development plan of the country and made it their own, and therefore sought to destroy institutions that were formed in the transition from apartheid to democratic state, that were built in the period at least from 1994 up to around 2011. So this deviation through radical economic transformation and the destruction of these institutions that were built for 18 years was arguably a form of a coup where an elite within the governing party marginalized many South Africans who believe in the collective and building a future for all, where these in the governing party, then in their destruction, not only did they led to the destruction of these institutions, which all of us are seeing, they also robbed the poor of the opportunities and the state itself to address the challenges of the poor in order for us to eliminate poverty and racial inequality by 2030. So what I'm saying, Vuyo, is that the capabilities in South Africa are there. They lie outside the state. However, if political choices are made by deviating from our national development plan, which is our plan to make the future work for all, not only for those who are radically and believe in economically transforming, because those, therefore, have destroyed those institutions. So up until we realize as South Africans, particularly the governing party, that it cannot implement on its own. It's fractious, it's divisive, and in doing so has marginalized many South Africans, black and white, who are capable, who are willing to contribute to the collective future. So until that political choice shifts away from the radicalism and the economic transformation that they talk to, towards a vision that puts South Africans at the center, because South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. Therefore, we all seek a better future for ourselves and for our children. And we need those energies of each and every citizen to transform and ensure that the future of South Africa, free of poverty, free of unemployment, is built by all, not by those who belong to the governing party who only believe in their own interests through radical economic transformation and are incapable of advancing the interest of our society, because it's only the interest of them which exclude us as we work so hard in formulating the plan that has so much been marginalized by radical economic transformation, which is embedded in the governing party of the day.
Just a quick one, Dr. Mondi. Are they really implementing radical economic transformation? Because, from people within their own ranks, you get a sense that is what the complaint is about from the so-called, promoters of radical economic transformation. They are complaining bitterly about those who are in government, saying they are actually not implementing radical economic transformation. Hence, you have people campaigning on that ticket because they believe it's going to strike a great deal of resonance from that grouping within the ANC that believes, or at least say they believe, in radical economic transformation. Where's the evidence that they are indeed doing that?
So, Vuyo, when we talk about one area which touches the lives of our people, it is the cost of moving for a child who wants access to an education from home to a school. It is about that worker who is earning a living wage, who relies on alternative transport arrangement, not only taxis, but commuter railway system. It is that worker who relies, whose life is very much dependent on light every morning, so that when he comes back from work, the food has been cooked because electricity has been provided. This is what we've seen in the past 12 years or so, where the infrastructure, which is critical to the poor, in us working towards a better South Africa, making sure that the poor, who are at least according to the work done by Professor Leibrand and many others, that when you look at our social distribution in South Africa, about 49% of South Africans are chronically poor, about 13% are transit poor, about 14% are vulnerable, and the middle class about 20% and the elite about 4%. So about 24% people can make do on their own. So when a government, Vuyo, allows the destruction of that infrastructure and make it so difficult for the poor to meet their basic needs under the guise of radical economic transformation, this is what I'm talking about, Vuyo. Mm-hmm. That what was meant to be radical economic transformation, which destroyed our institution, which robbed the poor of cheap and affordable and accessible infrastructure, and has led to the deepening and marginalization, particularly of African people, is the biggest problem and the biggest challenge that South Africa faces. Okay. That our promise of 1996 has been robbed and stolen, and therefore, when you talk about the plan, we need to go back to the plan, because the plan centers the citizen. It centers South Africans, black and white, as the drivers of their vision. as those that will make South Africa work. Not only a few in the governing party who radically transform because they believe that they've got a solution, when in fact they've destroyed all these institutions that I'm talking about.
Pelisa, can I then ask you to, on the back of what Dr. Moore has just said, that the plan actually centers so everything, can I then ask you to perhaps answer the very question you posed about whether the plan actually speaks to the challenges of today?
I think before that, I do want to, I disagree with Budmonli in relation to the issue of radical economic transformation. And I like the fact that you made a follow-up conversation, because I don't think we must confuse concepts here, right? I think the destruction of institutions is a destruction of institutions. It has nothing to do with economic transformation. In fact, if there was any, actually, would have not been sitting with 46% of South Africans, relying on social security, and 77% of young people who are unemployed, disengaged, and unproductive. So let's then come back into your question. So the key issue here is that the plan does center. I mean, there are a lot of progressive proposals that it makes, for example, around agricultural development. And I want to stick a little bit to that because it's linked to the point I made earlier on issue of urbanization, right, and social evolution, and how South Africa, for example, we could have been able to reverse certain things. Amongst those, the plan speaks to is an investment industrial development, which in fact, again, if the state had sufficient capacity, and this capacity, which one component I agree with Budmonli, is that it sits between the state and as well as private sector and citizens outside, is to actually, ensure that we decentralize industrial activities, right? So that those who are deciding to move off from their own, places of birth, they are moving off by choice. What in fact we've done in South Africa is that we've actually kind of perpetually connected Black South Africans in particular with the economy by selling their labor, which is something that has been happening in 1800, in 1900. So in essence, this is where we're not then able to meet what the development plan seeks to achieve. For example, if it speaks about agricultural development, it deals with issues of subsistence farmers, the support for subsistence farmers, which we know that a lot of rural people are doing it, and particularly women, right? And it contributes to food security, right? Currently, for example, South Africa is a nationally food secure country, but it's food insecure at a household level. So in essence, had we actually followed through what the National Development Plan on Agricultural Development seeks to achieve, we would have not been sitting with some of the challenges that we confront. I'm just talking about agriculture and its actually impact in labor absorption, in food security, but also in driving industrial development. Now, how it does that, for instance, the issue is in agriculture contributes in infrastructure development, because for farmers to move their produce from their farm into a marketplace, they need a good infrastructure. For farmers to actually present a good produce in a marketplace, they need good storage, right, for them to do that. And for farmers to be able, and there are certain products that require good infrastructure, like all the berries, for example. If you are in strawberry or if you are any of the berry products, if they are on the potholes and gravel roads, they will never make it to the market. And there are other cash crops, for example, that falls within that. So I think that's one chunk. Even when you talk about other areas around access to education, for instance, I mean, the issue of 33% pass rates, for example, which again is in contrast with what the National Development Plan seeks to achieve in as far as dealing and addressing educational system here. Because we know the role of education, by the way, is that fundamentally it's actually an equalizer. Once you have access to education, at least you're able to compete in the market, but also you're able to pursue certain things. Even though I am not discounting some of the psychosocial issues that in fact more often than not Black people are confronted with.
Okay.
So in essence, and even with the public healthcare system, I mean, we've seen in the Eastern Cape during the pandemic, the rate of death, for instance, as a result of deteriorated infrastructure of public healthcare. And the National Development Plan articulates very well on the need and how it links the social determination of health and the need to actually invest in life expectancy of citizens, but as well as in contributing in productivity of citizens. So he is correct, Mpumodi is correct to say it centers around that. So the key question is, why are we not able to achieve that?
Okay.
And
now,
this has nothing to do with radical economic.
My next question speaks, at least in part, to exactly what you said right at the end of your contribution there. Because Dr. Mundi, you said, or among the things you said earlier, was that the capacity lies outside the state, and so there has to be a recognition of that. And when the minister in the presidency and Professor Maluleke spoke last week about the appraisal that they had done as the commission. He said he promised that they are going to turn the situation around, and he said this was going to be done through 1, strong leadership, 2, a capable state, and then 3, an active citizenry. Now, do those 3 things speak to both your concerns, about why they are not implementing, but also what it will take to then correct the wrongs that they themselves or the new planning commission has actually identified?
We call this rhetoric. This is rhetoric. Firstly, why is it rhetoric? What we need to understand and appreciate in the ANC political rhetoric, for example, is that the words are always very mobilizing and look genuine, but the reality is something else. So if you look into how we mobilize the citizen, many of us in the academics and those in the civil society around support for the poor when we were locked down, eventually leading to the introduction of the support program that we call TES, the 350 rands that go to many individuals across the nation. Secondly, Vuyo, if we look at the critical energy crisis, which is so pivotal to what Pelisa is talking about, of reindustrialization, where since 2008, we have had the same problem. 2022, it gets worse and deeper. And we know that the private sector has been raising its hands through the various windows in the independent power producer. And today, at least, can you imagine if we didn't have that program and those private sector players that would have come in to support and complement ESKOM's generation? Thirdly, Vuyo, if you look into how we've addressed recently some of the challenges that are faced, particularly in mining towns, how the Mineral Council and other players in the mining sector are playing a much critical role beyond mining around making sure that water and other infrastructure, whether it's roads, are being managed and maintained because they want to ensure that those communities are viable, because the government failure and incapability needs to the mining players being attacked by communities because they're the only institution that's available. So what I'm saying to you, Vuyo, is that this is rhetoric. The state is incapable. That is why we need to think the ANC government itself needs to look inwardly and ask itself questions. Why is there a case for the existence of the deployment committee? Because by having deployment committees, it means basically that those that are inside the ANC will take preference. And therefore, basically many black, white South Africans who are capable, who have got no linking with the ANC whatsoever, but do have a link with the state, and they're capable to do the work, will be marginalized. So what I'm saying, Vuyo, is that the reality, what many of us have realized in South Africa, is that one of the biggest challenges that we faced, arguably, I know Pelisa pushes back, but the president of the ANC in the country in 2017, in his State of the Nation, talked about radical economic transformation and white monopoly capital and how the ANC government was going to deal with them. So there's a lot of denial by those linked to a governing party around the fact that the political choices that have been made, particularly after 2007, have led to the crisis that we have and deepened the crisis. And the only solution, Vuyo, that we were faced with for South Africa to move forward is really trying to work harder, as the President Ramaphosa has said, around social compact. But social compacting on its own is not going to advance us. What we need is to realize that actually, under an ANC regime, South Africa is going to continuously be in a crisis.
Okay.
Be it a crisis of education, be it a crisis of infrastructure, because simply there is no capability. They've shown over the past period that they cannot improve the infrastructure built by the apartheid regime. Okay,
we're going to leave it there for now. Thanks to both of you, Dr. Mondi there from Wits University, as well as Pelisa Ngomo, who is the chairperson of Oxfam, but also a development economist. To this now, they remain, in fact, as far as they are concerned, political arch enemies, the ANC and the DA, that is. But now we are told they are mulling a grand coalition that could run the Nelson Mandela Bay as early as next week, thanks to the local business community, NGOs, the churches that have actually been nudging these two political parties to form a grand coalition, or to find a way of working together in the interests of people in that region. Well, on the line we do have Luyolo Ngagula, who is the regional secretary of the African National Congress in the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, and we're hoping that he'll jump on as quickly as he can. Supposed to have the provincial leader of the Democratic Alliance, Ngaba Banga, who is also the former mayor there in that part of the world, just to get a sense of what these conversations have been about. Luyolo, thanks very much for your time. We don't know what happened to Ngaba. We've been trying him, and that's why we've had to delay this conversation a bit. Apologies for that. But what is the ANC's attitude towards what your NGOs, your churches, your business organizations are putting on the table to say work together, whether it's through an executive committee or something, but we have to break the impasse that we're seeing that we've seen up until now has to be broken?
Good evening, Putvuyo, to you and the viewers. One, I think, just to start off by affirming the fact that the African National Congress is in a coalition which is called the Government of Local Unity, with a conglomeration of smaller parties which are referred to as the Bloc. But rather, what has happened is that there's been a direct engagement with the African National Congress by civil society, academia, business, as part of means of contributing towards the process of stabilization of the city. As you would know, that the city is currently in disarray with the question of different contending views as it relates to the question of the accounting officer. There still is a big question mark as it relates to the question of the speaker. And these are things that have thrown the institution called the municipality into disarray. As a consequence of that, there's been an inability to pass the adjustment budget. There's been an inability to note the IDP, which would then give way for the developmental trajectory of the municipality itself. So there was an engagement which was held at a bilateral level between ourselves and the civil society, which was initiated by the civil society as they'd been engaging with our provincial leadership as the African National Congress. But from the viewpoint of the African National Congress in the region, we are a unitary organization, and the question of coalitions, as per our own structures of the ANC, is a question which is managed by the structures above us, fundamentally the national structure and the provincial structures. So we were mandated to go to that particular engagement. So that was engagement with civil society, and we went there, we interacted, a presentation was made, and we requested to go back as African National Congress to speak amongst ourselves and the various structures of the ANC, so that a follow-up meeting could be held. But I think the focal thing which came out there is that there is a need to stabilize the city. There is a need to bring about a particular process which will result in these particular bottlenecks being broken, because the reality is that the material impact of the budget adjustment not being passed has a direct bearing to a resident in KwaNobuhle, a resident in KwaZakhele, a resident in Motherwell, and it has a direct bearing on the delivery of services and many other facets which can militate an environment of various opportunities or multitudes of opportunities in the city itself. So those are the conversations which are being held now, Pudufuyo, as to whether was there a proposal of a coalition, as you put it, or a grand coalition. There are a number of scenarios which were presented to ourselves. Civil society did say to us that it is engaging the African National Congress, it will engage the Democratic Alliance, but it will engage all parties in council itself. Okay. So from the viewpoint of the ANC, we are currently talking amongst ourselves.
Okay, now, I mean, there's a meeting that was called earlier this week by the acting city manager for Thursday next week. And then this morning, we saw another circular calling for a meeting on Tuesday, assuming the ANC will attend the Tuesday meeting, which, council meeting, which I'm told it will. What's going to be your attitude going into that meeting then?
Well, Pudufuyo, I think the first point to clarify from the viewpoint of the African National Congress, we do not have a person who's called acting city manager. We've got a person who is city manager in the form of Dr. Mwazi, who was duly appointed by council.
I thought the court dealt with that, though.
Amongst, pardon?
I thought the court dealt with that.
No, the court dealt and dismissed the application, but did not nullify the appointment of Dr. Mwazi, and it did not, in essence, render it a nullity, that particular meeting which affected that particular appointment. So from the viewpoint of the ANC, Pudufuyo, there is a city manager in the city who has been duly appointed. And that goes back to the point of part of the implications of the judgment itself, just to digress a bit, because it does not then put a nullity in terms of that particular meeting which appointed Dr. Mwazi. As well, it does not put a nullity in terms of the subsequent meeting which was held thereafter. Rather, all issues have been referred back to council for its own resolution, because the court was of the view that the issues are still within the purview of council to resolve itself. So what you are seeing then probably is part of that particular process. There are engagements amongst the various parties in council itself. There are engagements amongst the coalition partners themselves, because part of the issues which were permeating in that particular space of Nelson Mandela was also a difference of approach and opinion amongst the coalition partners themselves. So there are talks of council meeting, but I'm just articulating from the viewpoint of the African National Congress that we do not have a person who is acting city manager. What we have from the viewpoint of the African National Congress is a city manager who has been duly appointed by council. So there are talks of a meeting to be convened on the 25th amongst the various parties themselves, but there is an ongoing political process. But the intention there, all that is centered around, is to probably break what is a bottleneck and find the amicable solution, which will then militate and create an environment for the efficient delivering of services.
Okay, we're going to leave it there for this evening. Once again, apologies for what happened earlier. That's the regional ANC secretary in the Nelson Mandela Bay, Loyolo Ngagula, taking us through what their perspective is, following, of course, those conversations that they as political parties have been having with civil society groups like your business, your NGOs, your churches, and the like. From what we are told, people are much closer to one another. These two parties in the main, ANC and the DA, that is, than has been the case before. We'll see how the situation unfolds over the next week or so. And that's our show for this evening. We leave you with these visuals of the drama and fireworks that journalists witnessed earlier today when Parliament's Public Accounts Committee was making an oversight visit at ESKOM. ESKOM board member Busisiwe Mavuso walking out of that meeting following a heated exchange with SCOPA chair Mkhuleko Hlengwa.
It's not an insult, it's facts, Honorable Hadebe. That this is the mess of the ANC-led government.
I'm going to let you in one way or the other go during content of Parliament. I indicated that this meeting is a Parliament meeting. If this is how you behave in the board, you're not going to behave like that. And I know what cameras do. I know what they do. They do this. They derail us from the fundamental issues. And you know, the CEO has been in pains this morning to take us through these issues with a particular patience and just zooming into the issues. And that is why we're all sitting here listening and taking notes. He's not engaging in theatrics, that's what it is. That's what cameras do. So either you behave yourself or you excuse yourself from this meeting.
I'll excuse myself.
Yeah, I think you used to that.
I think I should also. Thank you.
I think you should. Then you were wanting to leave at 11, so you are engineering this.
Yeah, which is fine.
Yeah, because and we'll be making fundamental recommendations about yourself and your very unprofessional conduct. It's in fact politics of the gutter as far as I'm concerned.